Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and take a look at our work at fff.org. Back issues of the Libertarian Angle are posted there, along with thousands upon thousands of articles, blogs, and perspectives and videos that we've done over our 28-year history. Richard, okay, it's Christmas time, and that's, of course, the time when we start thinking about giving and, helping out other people. I guess it's really what we should be thinking about all year long. But at Christmas time, we do think about that. Charity, helping out others in need. And that, of course, conjures up the image of the welfare state, because the America's welfare state is justified by those on the left, well, and those on the right also. They also believe in the welfare state as something showing goodness and caring and compassion on the American people. That is, that the fact that the IRS taxes people a large portion of their incomes or their assets and then redistributes them through welfare agencies to the poor and needy shows that Americans are a good and caring people, and that this is no different from what happens at Christmas time when people are giving gifts or donations to help out others in need. Now, we both know that there's a fundamental difference there. The standard conservative and liberal, Democrat and Republican, can't see the difference. But we know what that difference is. And you and I have written about this probably every Christmas season for the many years that we've been writing. You've done an article in the past called something about Santa Claus here. Yes, Virginia, there is no Santa Claus, or something like that. Because I think my recollection is that you compare the federal government to Santa Claus because it's bringing gifts and so forth. Mm-hmm. But there is a fundamental difference between what the government does with the welfare state and what people do in the private sector with private charity. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, and that fundamental distinction, the essential characteristic that separates the government activity from you and my or private sector activity, is freedom versus compulsion. What makes an act ethical, moral, virtuous? It's the fact that it is an act freely chosen by a person when he could have done the opposite. If I am put in chains and commanded under the threat of violence to do certain things, perform certain acts, proceed to follow certain courses of action, when if I do not, physical harm or even death is threatened against me, then we wouldn't consider this an act of free will or free choice or self-decision making. It would be considered a forced act. Now, the same thing applies if someone commands me, again under the use of the threat of force, to do what he has defined and decided are virtuous or good acts. That is, you will be nice to this person. You will do these altruistic or philanthropic things for this person. And by making you do this, I'm making you a moral or ethical person. And the answer would have to be the same as my previous example. The example would have to lead us to say no. No act is virtuous or moral or ethical when the individual did not have the opportunity and the option to do its opposite or to do nothing at all. An ethical act is when a person freely chooses to act in a certain way towards other members of the community around him, family, friends, or even strangers. The compulsion of the welfare state may seem to involve charity and the ethics of goodness, but in fact it is a stripping away of that idea of its most fundamental aspect. Let me sort of give an example of what I'm getting at here. A few years ago, the German news magazine Der Spiegel had an article in which they had interviewed and surveyed a good number of prominent corporate executives in the world of German enterprise and business. And they asked these executives, did they feel any obligation or through their companies to do charitable and philanthropic work? The vast majority of them, Der Spiegel reported, said no. It is the duty of the government to do those things for which, as an individual or as our corporate entity, we are taxed. Well, by saying that, you've abrogated all responsibility. It's basically saying it's not my responsibility to have benevolence, to have a sense of caring, to have a sense of goodwill towards my fellow man. But I am giving that responsibility to someone whose only means of doing it, supposedly in my name, is to force me to pay sums of money, the giving of which over which I have no control unless I want to go to jail. And that is crucial. I'll just say one other thing. I do believe, as these German businessmen were suggesting in their replies, that it desensitizes and dehumanizes us. What is one of the elements that makes us human, Jacob? We are social creatures. We're born into families, communities, societies. We develop senses of shared values, shared goals and purposes, a shared sense of life. And that includes a sense, I believe, properly understood in the classical liberal and libertarian way, a concern for our fellow man. Whether you want to say it charitableness, or whether, to use Ayn Rand's phrase, a proper sense of rational benevolence, whatever. But the idea that a free person realizes that he's not an island, not just in the gains from trade and the buying and selling of goods, but those around him who a sense of conscience leads him to feel that there are those who are deserving of his assistance because they have fallen upon bad times, not of their own making, et cetera, et cetera. When the government taxes away people's income and wealth to the point where they can virtually do little or none of this, then in a sense it destroys part of our humanness that would be involved in the sense of shared humanity. And therefore it makes us less than human. And then if I can just continue, one other thing is here. What is the right charity? What is the right type of benevolence? When the government siphons off our wealth into its own hands in the name of doing these charitable things which go under the name of the welfare state, then who will be benefited? How the money will be dispersed? What in-kind services may be provided by the government through those siphoned off tax dollars is determined by those who run the state, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the elites who know how society should be organized and run, rather than it being left in the hands of individuals. That not only keeps it in the hand of free choice, but like in all competitive settings, what is the best way to help people if they have fallen upon hard times? How do you help them get back on their feet? How do you help them get sort of skills and training so they could be self-supporting through a job in the marketplace? How do you help or teach them to just better manage their own affairs and thinking about the future as well as the present? What is the best strategies? Well, in the marketplace, we know that there are many different competitive ways to figure out what is it that people want, how to best manufacture it at lowest cost, with what qualities, features, and characteristics. And that's part of the competitive process that assures that a wide variety of different opportunities are offered to consumers, and a constant way of trying to do it better and less expensively and more bang for the buck. Why would we not expect the same thing, Jacob, with private charity? Many people think, well, there are poor people who need help. But his way of trying to help them is not what I consider the best way. I think this method would be far superior and help those who we both have a concern for. So different competing charitable organizations, different methods and techniques, different ways of giving a helping hand. And therefore there's a competitive of charitable improvement that would be given and done through private sector ways of doing this that become crowded out, opted out of, when the government becomes the manager of one size fits all. So even besides the ethical point of view or ethical premise that I was highlighting, just from a utilitarian practical point of view, you care about the poor, let's say, you care about the less well off. Well, how best to help them? And that itself is as much of a discovery process through the competition of charities as we expected in how to make a better pair of glasses or a shirt that is more resistant to a stain. It may sound mundane and somehow crass to express it that way, but you want minds to be set free, whether in the marketplace or in the avenues of charitable giving. You want to set minds free to devise the best ways to help those that people have decided are deserving of their helping hand.
Yeah, those are excellent points. You know, I was recently asked whether by a person if libertarianism was consistent with Christianity, and my response was, well, it actually is the only philosophy that is consistent with Christianity. That conservatism and liberalism both are inconsistent with Christianity precisely because of the point you're making about coercion. That under Christian principles, God has endowed man with free will. And this is a great God-given gift. And okay, well, what does that mean? It means that God has entrusted people with the ability to say yes or no, or to choose this course of action versus that course of action. Now, there's people in both the conservative and the liberal movement who implicitly say, they don't argue this overtly, but by their support of the welfare state, they argue God made a mistake by entrusting people with that kind of freedom. You can't trust people with that kind of freedom because they won't do the right thing. They won't voluntarily help others. And so we need to use Caesar or the coercive apparatus of the IRS to force them to do this. So we're going to correct God's mistake in trusting people. Well, libertarianism says no. Freedom entails the right to say no. That means the right of everybody to keep everything he earns, no income tax, you keep it all, and you decide for yourself what to do with your money. Now, is it theoretically possible that everybody would turn his back on his neighbor that's in need? Sure. But that's one of the dangers of freedom. That's the risk that God was willing to take when he vested man with free will. That's what conservatives and liberals think is a mistake. Now, if I go, let's say, if I go into a street and I find a very wealthy person, I can tell he's wealthy, and he's carrying a large amount of money. I've seen him in a store buying Christmas presents and pulling out a wad of cash, and I push him into an alley and I pull out a gun and I say, okay, give me everything on you, and he's got like $5,000 in cash. He gives it all to me, and I take that money straight to the local hospital and I ask who here is really, really poor and can't afford their medical bills, and I pay those medical bills with that $5,000. I think most everyone would feel uncomfortable with that. I mean, I would say, look, I'm a great person. I'm a good person. I'm helping out that guy. He's got medical bills. He can't afford it. Look what a good person I am. I think most everyone would recognize, Jacob, you're nothing but a thief. You know, if you're going to help that person, help him with your own money. Don't go and steal somebody else's money. Or if even, let's say I took a gun and forced the guy to go with me to the hospital and say, now, help that person by paying off his medical bills. And I'm pointing the gun at him. I think most everyone would say, no, Jacob, that's not any better. But what's fascinating, Richard, is that when this same conduct gets translated into a democracy through a vote in Congress, where Congress says we're going to enact a law that takes this $5,000 from that rich person and gives it over here to this poor person, that all of a sudden this has not only converted the rich guy who's being taxed into a good and caring person, it's converted everybody in society, because we live in this democracy where our elected representatives have enacted a welfare state program. That means we're all good and caring and compassionate. And it's all just a great big fraud and a sham. It's a system that really is just legalized robbery. And that's what conservatives and liberals believe in. And if you look at the whole gamut of welfare state programs, I mean, you can start with the crown jewel, which is Social Security. Contrary to what seniors say, there's no retirement fund. You didn't put your money into a fund where, has a lockbox with your name on it at Fort Knox. It's a straight welfare program. That's all it is. It's taking money from young people, working people, and giving it to seniors. You can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, foreign aid to dictators. I mean, that's welfare for dictators. And where's the morality in that? Yeah, conservatives and liberals say, "Oh, Jacob, you're a good person because we're helping out these foreign dictators with your money who are tyrannizing and oppressing their people." But it's all nonsense, Richard. It's immoral nonsense. The only moral system is one where people are free to keep everything they earn and decide for themselves what to do with it. And that means you got to have faith. You got to have faith in freedom. You got to have faith in the market process. You have to have faith in yourself. You got to have faith in others. You got to have faith in God. And you got to eliminate this sense of, no, we have to have Caesar force people to do these types of things.
Yeah, I think your example of the person pulled into the alley and robbed. Let us suppose that there was a gang that ran a protection racket, and they would go into local stores and shops and basically strong arm and intimidate the owners of these businesses that they better pay them a fee to see that nothing happens bad to their business, which of course basically means you either pay us or we're going to come in and break up or even burn down your shop or kill you or some other member of your family. But then this gang turns around and like some mafia bosses have been known to do, they generously do things in the local neighborhood in which they live. A park where young kids can play basketball, or giving to some local charity at holiday time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would anyone consider that justification, rationalizing acceptance of the means by which they got the money that they, let's say, even predominantly redistributed to other people in the mafia bosses community? Was that not good charity? Was there not like a little fund for the elderly people in the neighborhood who couldn't quite support themselves, supplying them with some free food each week, sort of like Meals on Wheels and so on and so forth? Would that justify the means by which they had acquired it? That is threatening physical harm to the owners of these small businesses and the destruction of the means by which they earn a living in terms of destroying the building. I would argue that most of us, as you were suggesting, would say no. But this is basically the rationale. It is okay for government representing all of us to take that which has been honestly and peacefully earned by members of the society and take it under the threat of force and redistribute it as they, the politicians, the bureaucrats, know is the better way. And if we were as wise and intelligent and thoughtful as them, we would know would be the way we ourselves would spend it if we were only as good as them. That's the mentality. And I think that it's a difficult mentality to overcome because there is this long now history of taking for granted that government does these things. But sometimes the existing way of doing things are both immoral and inefficient and counterproductive. And the only way of challenging this is to say the emperor has no clothes, that this is just theft, couching itself in beautiful rhetoric of caring and good deeds, when in fact it is theft. And theft should not be condoned. And in fact, by taking the money in this way, you're denying people the opportunity to do the right thing as conscience may call them to do so, and to find out the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out the founding principles of the United States. I mean, look at the kind of society we live in today. I don't think anybody would deny that it's a highly dysfunctional society. You've got suicide rates that are soaring. You've got mass unexplained killings, massive drug addiction, alcoholism. It's not exactly the most healthy society that's ever been. And people can't understand why, and I'm no psychologist, but I would suggest that one of the main reasons might be because this is what happens under a welfare warfare state way of life. That Americans of our time and Americans of the 20th century decided to reject the founding principles of this country, both with respect to their adoption of the welfare state and their adoption of the warfare state, or what is also known as the deep state or the national security state. Neither of those two ways of life existed in the United States for more than 100 years. They were not part of our founding principles. There was no income tax. There was no Federal Reserve. There was solid money consisting of gold coins and silver coins. There was no paper money. The founding fathers said no plunder and looting, either through income taxation or through monetary debasement. People were free to keep everything they earned, and then there was open immigration. I mean, this is the way people cared about people who were suffering from overseas monstrous conditions like tyrannies and oppression. They said, hey, if you can get out, you can come here, and we promise you will not be deported, forcibly deported to your land. Okay. And there's no CIA, no NSA, no big military industrial complex, a small basic military force. Okay, it turns out that was the most prosperous society in history up to that point. Oh, and by the way, also the most charitable society. If you look in the late 1800s, there was this society and this foundation and the women's rights movements, and everybody was benefiting from a highly prosperous society because people had money to donate now. They weren't just trying to survive. So here, the society where everybody was free to keep everything they earned, no coercive welfare state apparatus, no big military establishment. Everybody, the society was booming, prospering, and they were giving money away. This is how the opera houses, the museums, the libraries were getting established, along with all of the charitable organizations. So America abandons all that. In the 1930s, with the adoption of the mandatory welfare state that Roosevelt introduced with Social Security, and then later, with Medicare and Medicaid under the Johnson administration, and then all the rest of it, farm subsidies, education grants, aid to dictators, the whole gambit of it, and then of course the warfare state. And people sit here and say, gosh, I wonder why we have all this dysfunctionality in American society. Well, I suggest, one is because we've rejected our founding principles, and two, because all too many people don't realize that they've rejected America's founding principles. They're sitting here and denying it, and denying the reality, and believing that the welfare warfare state way of life is freedom. Because you can see that in their, when they start singing, hey, thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free and the troops are protecting our freedom overseas. And, they're convinced they're free. The tighter the government tightens the screws with respect to the welfare warfare state, including, of course, the drug war that we haven't mentioned here, but is worth mentioning because it's a direct violation of freedom as part of this welfare state mentality that the government is here to take care of you, even if that means sending you to the penitentiary for 60 or 70 years for doing harmful things to yourself.
Well, I think the point that you've just made is people's lack of understanding of how, in these aspects of life, how much less freedom we have today than most, if not all, Americans had at an earlier time, is due to two things. The success of the educational propaganda. Anyone who goes through grade school, high school, into college, and takes American history classes learns very little about what you just said. Do they ever have quoted to them a notable passage in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, written in the 1830s after spending about, I believe, 9 months traveling around the United States at that time? And one of the things he points out, I believe it is in volume 2, he talks about the charitable organizations that he observed. And he said wherever he'd go, free Americans are forming associations, clubs, groups, whether it be for religious purposes or community endeavors or educational activities or philanthropic, medical and hospital purposes. Everywhere you turn are men coming together and forming these voluntary institutions of free association to pursue jointly goals, purposes, and ends they share. And he even says, after describing this, that he considers that this one of the most profound institutional ways that people have found to solve their social and community problems that should be given great note by those in Europe. Now, that's all been forgotten. It's all been forgotten down this sort of an Orwellian memory hole. The extent to which not just private charities, but in Great Britain, the friendly societies that enabled private options for health insurance, death benefits, unemployment disability coverage, et cetera, and how many huge portions of the population in Great Britain and the versions of it here in the United States were covered by this in the 19th century. All of that has been lost in the history of Americans, because those in charge of writing the textbooks and teaching the history have had no motive and incentive of sharing that information about a different way and a success of solving these problems. And to be fair, then there's the other element of history itself, in the sense of lived time. It has been now so long since Americans have ever experienced and known such a world without these government programs that it doesn't seem imaginable to them. The analogy I always use is that suppose that for the last 100 years, government had providing for free, that is through tax dollars, shoes for Americans, particularly for the young, because after all, it is for the children. Little feet grow. And, you know, there was a time when parents maybe didn't care about putting shoes on their kids' feet because it cost money every so often to get a new pair. Parents were uncaring. They only wanted to buy shoes for themselves. Maybe they didn't have the money. And why? The image of all of these barefoot Americans, because they either didn't have the self-control to put some money aside to buy their own shoes or shoes for their little kids. So then government came along and provided shoes for everyone for free, because surely everyone is entitled to a pair of shoes. Why, it's a human right to have something covering your feet. And now someone like Jacob Hornberger, or even worse, the infamous Richard Ebeling, comes along and says, what the hell is government doing in the shoe business? Oh no, what do you mean you're going to end this? Well, how can you be sure that the parents won't going back to leave their little kiddies barefoot, or they'll get ringworm and cut their little toes on the rough ground? Oh, you must not care about your fellow man. Now, this example sounds ludicrous. Why? Because we take for granted that people are responsible to buy their own shoes and the shoes of their family members, and the market provides this wide spectrum of quality, size, type, and price that fits everyone's budget. But because it's been so out of sight and out of mind for so long, that people can't imagine a world without the welfare state, the world without the government siphoning off all this wealth and people being responsible to take an action with their fellow citizens to cover these problems. It's because we've lost that memory. And to be honest, even the teachers who teach these things in class, oh, without the welfare state, blah, 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 they themselves are victims, because this has been going on long enough that they don't know any better, because that's what they learned in their own textbooks. And therefore, there's an important educational role here. The principle of liberty, the nature of how it would work competitively, and the history of how it was done at a time when these issues were treated on the basis of freedom that we have lost.
Well, I think you might have put your foot in your mouth with that analogy.
Well, you know, if the shoe fits.
Okay. I think you're absolutely right about this notion that people grow up into this system and they're born and raised under it, and so they just cannot imagine it. And you brought up the propaganda and the indoctrination that takes place in public schooling, and most people don't recognize that throughout the 19th century there was no systems of public schooling, and but now, since we've all been born and raised, everybody, it's like a narcotic. People say, "Oh my gosh, how would I live? How would we live without public education?" Everybody would be stupid, because they cannot imagine that a free market educational system works, even though they can see that the free market produces the best of everything. And that you see it, especially this narcotic working in Social Security. I mean, you do a survey of seniors, and I guarantee you 95% of them will say, oh, Jacob, I couldn't live without Social Security. I wouldn't survive. Well, somehow or another, Americans live without Social Security for more than 25 years. But once you get on this dole, it's like a narcotic, it's like heroin. It destroys self-reliance, it destroys self-esteem, it destroys this spirit of can-do, and it just makes people helplessly dependent on the government. Oh my gosh, I couldn't do it. And that's the trouble. People have lost faith in themselves. They've lost faith in the market. They've lost faith in freedom. And you alluded to this earlier. I think it's an extremely important point, that the welfare state destroys the opportunity to help out people. That there's so many young people today that are barely making it in life. They can't save any money. They live from check to check. They can't put anything away. So they have very little money to donate. So they're not faced with these choices. Should I donate to the church? Should I donate to this person? Because they're going, trying to just make things work, trying to make ends meet. Well, in large part, that's because the government's fleecing them for all these programs, both welfare and warfare. That if I would invite young people, look at your paycheck and see how much is being taken out by all things, the FICA, the income tax, everything. And then imagine if you could keep that money every month. I mean, the way, when we started FFF, Richard, I was telling people, look, how much do you pay in income taxes? Let's say it's on average of $20,000 a year. Well, that was 30 years ago. Now, suppose you'd had that money. There was no income tax. That's 20,000 times what? 30 years. What's that? 600,000? That's a lot of money that people could have in their savings for education, health care, and so forth. People don't think about that. And so when you're fleecing people, it's depriving them of the opportunity of exercising freedom, whether to help their parents, whether they help this person need, whether to donate to the church or not. They're destroying not only freedom, but people's opportunity to grow with freedom.
Yes, if I can sort of do a plug here, and that is that in the United States, we are fortunate that while tax levels and regulation are very oppressive in the sense of the degree of freedom that we have lost, we are still a lot freer than the tax levels, let's say, in a variety of welfare statist European countries. And there is still remaining a greater spirit of private giving in the United States than in other countries. I believe that the latest data is for, I think, 2016, which I saw. And Americans gave not quite, but almost $1 trillion in 2016 in charitable private giving. And then thousands upon thousands of hours of charitable giving in the form of in-kind activities, people doing things with their church or some other charitable organization. We still have a greater spirit of that than other countries, but it is being weakened. It has been, there's been a loss of our knowledge and appreciation of its role and importance. And we should be concerned about losing more of it, that we don't reach the point where it is basically in Europe, where the type of philanthropic and private charity we take for granted even still here today does not exist in Europe. And in that setting, I would just like to say that for those viewers and listeners who are hearing what Jacob and I have to talk about today and think that these ideas have merit and value, at this time of year, since people still are free to give their money and spend it in ways that they prefer after what government has already taken in taxes, I hope each and every one of you would consider in some modest or more than modest way of contributing to the Future of Freedom Foundation. I've had the opportunity to work with Jacob Hornberger now for almost 30 years, and it has been an honor and privilege for me to do so. The first 13 years of the organization, I served as its vice president before I went on to do other things. And as far as I'm concerned, there is virtually no other organization that so consistently and in a principled way stands for these freedom ideas. But the work can only be done if people are willing to help it to be done. And that is asking each and every one of you to think about having the Future Freedom Foundation on your charitable Christmas list, because I can assure you that every dollar given is wisely spent, efficiently spent, and used in ways that advance these ideas of liberty. And it has been my honor and privilege for all of these years to work with Jacob Hornberger, who's been the spearhead and the inspiration for the founding of the organization and everything it has done since it began almost 30 years ago.
That's very kind, Richard. I appreciate the kind words. And yeah, we couldn't do these kind of programs without this extra support that people give us. And you and I, Richard, have always believed, since we met more than 30 years ago, have always believed in the power of ideas, especially ideas on liberty, sound ideas on liberty. And we believe that they can transform society. So no matter how bad things are with the welfare warfare state, one can never lose hope, because there's always hope for a better world tomorrow, because you never know what tomorrow can bring. And the only thing that can bring that shift are ideas that first grab a person's mind and then their heart, and then all of a sudden they sweep across a society like wildfire, and then you see that shift coming. And that's what we do here at FFF. That's what we do here with the Libertarian Angle, what we do with our blogs and our perspectives and our conferences and so forth. But there's no way we could do it without those of you that help us out in a bigger way. So, Richard, it's been a real honor working with you as well for all these 30-some-odd years, and especially value our friendship. So, on that note, we got to wrap things up. Richard, enjoyed the show, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next week, bye-bye.